All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for having me today. Well, having me on Zoom, but thank you very much. As I said to Pete when we discussed this session, I sort of bit his hand off because I'm sort of desperate to be involved in these sorts of processes, and I have a lot of respect for what you're trying to do here all together today, and the process you're going through. Quick note about me: the reason why I think I'm here today to talk to you about how does change happen, how change can be made to happen, is that I've been working on policy since my time in academia, where I got my PhD in political economy, through to the kind of work that I do now in policy world and think tanks. That said, I should say right from the beginning, this is probably the most difficult presentation I've ever had to give. It's an incredibly hard, complex question. It starts simple, but there's so many layers to it. I'm going to try and reveal some of those layers to you and some of the thinking that might go behind them in a minute. And maybe it'll be a kind of a useful and empowering process as you contemplate what you want to do as part of this assembly, as part of this panel. So how does change happen? That's a question people in my line of work, people in the policy world, ask ourselves every single day. We have things we care about, policy ideas, and we think, well, what should we be arguing for, and how might it be accomplished? And of course, the real kicker for that question is it has to be realistic as well. I can't just sort of do pie in the sky. I want everything to change. I want the worlds to be made of candy floss. I can't imagine up an ideal world and make it happen. Realism has to be baked into what we do. What's possible within our system? What can we argue for plausibly? What changes can actually happen, and who, what, which system, which lever can be pulled to make a shift in the way that things actually operate? And the answers to that question, that deceptively simple question, how does change happen? They are complex, but I have three, I think, unarguably true messages that I want to get across to you today. And then I'm going to kind of elaborate around them in an order that hopefully makes sense. Message number one, there are many, many big problems, but many big problems are actually easier to at least start to address at smaller scales than at global, full scale, holistic scale. So many problems are easier to address locally and at smaller scales than you might expect. And I'm going to try and explain why. And I think that's probably a pertinent thing to try and get to in a conversation with a focused session based on Copeland, like we're doing now. Number two, the only reason that large scale change ever happens is if enough pressure of one kind or another is exerted in the aggregate. In the end, the person who pushes the button, pulls the lever, writes the law, does the big move in the commons or the big play at the international scale, that might be the work of an individual or a team or a whole bunch of people. But actually, the thing that causes that to happen happens way back in the chain, way downstream. And it's about aggregate pressure from lots and lots of different people working together, deciding they have common ground, deciding they agree on certain things. Number three, and I think this might be the most important one, to make change happen, you do have to start by knowing what specifically you want to see change and how. And again, not ideally, not the ideal change, and this is a hard leap to make, but the best change that could plausibly occur given realistic constraints. And maybe we can talk a bit about what those realistic constraints look like too. So just to start us off after those three big points, I think the three sort of big concepts or words that are going to be really relevant to this question of how do you make change happen. The three big P words are power, politics, and policy. And these are words that I think we use fairly frequently, especially power. So when we talk about power, what do we mean? We're talking, I think, about influence, the ability to make things happen that wouldn't otherwise happen, to make a change occur. Power is all about who has it, where it lies. It's about its distribution. We only ever really think and talk about power in the policy world when we think about its distribution. And it's a complex one. You can't simply answer the question, where is the power? Who has the power? I mean, there's obviously a very clear answer that will satisfy most people, but there's a lot more complexity and depth to it. Power is at once extremely concentrated and very widely distributed. Those two things are true at the same time, and it's a paradox, and we're all grappling with it all the time in my line of work. So in our political system in this country, national government has the most power, full stop. We're in a hugely centralized country. But local government has just enough autonomy, perhaps not as much as some people would want it to, but has just enough autonomy to do things, to get things done as well. And then there's the private sector, which is quite distinct, though regulated by government, both central and local. And businesses, as we know, talking about climate change, account for a huge amount of carbon intensive activity. The changes they make, the effects they have on the world can be really, really important. And just to add one more layer of complexity, we do live in a mass democracy and we live in a market or broadly market economy. So both business and government at all scales are ultimately, at least to some extent, dependent on the public approval, public consent for their authority. So let's think about the local authority. Let's think about your council, however much you tend to engage with it and think about it. Does the council have power in our system? It has a bit of power. And who has power within the council? The officers, in other words, the civil servants who run the public services that are delivered locally by the council and is to some extent created locally and designed locally too. The councillors, the people who actually get voted for by constituents in different wards. How much influence can those people wield relative to each other? How much can they in turn be influenced by the people who are resident in your council, in a council? How much influence can the council have over the central government? And how much influence can central government have over the council? Well, that's a pretty one-directional thing. Central government has a lot more power than local government. Civil servants, the officers in a council, have to ultimately be answerable to the democratic mandate of councillors themselves. But councillors ultimately, at least to some extent, have to be answerable to you, to citizens in the aggregate. So it's a complex picture, this power. And answering these sorts of questions about power gets us to those other two Ps, power and then politics and policy. So politics, we can just sum up as the way we figure out who in government, in a position of influence, ought to have the power. And policy is the plans that the people with power will then go on and try to implement. So we can, I think we're close enough now to a position where we can imagine the traditional model, like the kind of the classic way that we might imagine that change could happen starting from me as a normal person. So me, normal person number one, gets to influence power via a political process. And sometimes I get to impact policymaking through a consultation, or maybe I can kind of get involved in a much more radical way if the council's really forward-looking locally. That's it. It's a vote. It's a bit of letter writing if I'm really into it. It's a little bit of standing up. And if I'm lucky, my council will be setting up a citizens' jury and I can jump in on that. And maybe every so often I'm a service user and I get consulted about how that service should function. So the reality is that model for power distribution and making change happen doesn't really play out very often in our country. Most people don't vote in local elections. Even when they do vote, they usually don't make a pivotal difference to the outcome. People are only occasionally able to make a change through campaigning and consultation. Plenty of people and organizations have lots of power, whether or not anyone has ever voted for them, as anyone who's been tracking that Dominic Cummings saga will know, or anyone who's ever interacted with a big business will know as well. So the legitimacy question keeps coming up. So the reality of influence, the reality of power and making change happen, this is where scale becomes important. And I'm going to talk to you now about a bunch of local issues that you'll understand a lot better than me, because I'm stuck here down in South London and you're up there in a much lovelier part of the world, I'm sure. But there's a very famous saying, all politics is local. I'm sure you've all heard that before. The reality is that all policy is local too. And just from a little bit of research and a few conversations in preparation for today, I have here a short list of things that are up for question, issues that are really salient, really current right now, where you live, that have enormous relevance to questions about climate change. First of all, the big one, the coal mine, the Woodhouse Colliery. There are going to be arguments on both sides about the legitimacy of that approach. Number two, there's a nuclear waste depository at Drigg, which is publicly, and it's actively been discussed, vulnerable to coastal erosion, a product of climate change. Number three, local transport resilience versus extreme weather events is turning into a big deal where you live, from my understanding. There's a railway at Parton that fell into the sea a little more than a year ago. Isn't that right? Extreme weather events have been connected to the effects of climate change. So local resilience, that's something that gets decided and acted upon and measured out locally.
Simon, just to interrupt, that's 10 minutes gone, so five more minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Number 4, the ongoing question over whether Whitehaven should have a bypass, I think, is something that people keep coming back to. What will that do to car usage with its implications on air quality and carbon emissions? How will that affect the town centre? There have been landslips due to extreme weather events. And there's the mooted possibility of future nuclear disposal facilities. And obviously, the place where you live is going to be right at the top of the list of the potential sites for that. Should they happen? Should that support the wider nuclear industry, which itself could then nationally play a huge role in combating further emissions in future in power generation? Do local people want it? Who should make that decision? How should it be made? These are local questions. They're not national ones. And they're all climate change. At the local scale, you can have an enormous amount of influence on very specific problems, on people with the power to make those decisions, and on the policy making that'll change the picture for the issue that you're discussing right now. Now, there's a problem here. The UK is arguably the most centralized political and economic structure in the world. So that local picture becomes really important, because the levers we can pull to affect the national picture, even to make recommendations for the national picture, are really limited. And that's something I butt my head against. That's a wall I run into very routinely in my job as well. So power, who can do what? National government can create new laws to make things legal or illegal. They can regulate the behaviors of other organizations and individuals, and they can tax things for revenue or to produce change. So one thing that people always talk about in reference to climate change is, oh, we should introduce a carbon tax to allow businesses to cost in the carbon consequences of all the activities they get into, and then pass costs on to the everyday consumer. Now we're running into a really important concept here, and I'm glad we've just about found time to get to it, which is the idea of unintended consequences. The main barrier, the thing that trips up policymaking in the pursuit of things that almost everyone might agree is a good idea, is the fear, the risk of unintended consequences, of bad outcomes, of failures that you don't plan ahead for, because the system is complex. And when you pull a lever, you may not know exactly what's going to happen as a result. And that leads institutions, politicians, policymakers, officials to be risk averse. Now, in your position, you may be in a position to be less risk averse, but that's a constraint, a real world constraint that might affect what you want to do. That's the national picture. Local government can be risk averse too, but local government can do slightly different things to national government. They can directly move to facilitate communities and neighborhoods and households to pursue their own objectives. They can use their own voice to lobby national government for what local people think is best or right. They can work to support certain kinds of business rather than others. They can find ways to fund desirable projects and behaviors, to empower communities with assets. They can prevent some things from happening. They can invest wisely or indeed unwisely. So there's lots of things that can happen at these different scales. And there's also a hard limit to what's realistic, given the realities of the world that we live in. So I just want to quickly, and I think I've got a minute or something left, Jenny. I'm just going to quickly, have I?
I'm just getting myself, yes, you've got 2 minutes left.
I've got 2 minutes. Okay, so hopefully I can get through this next bit. I just want to bring up something that I'm sure you've already talked about here. One of the other things that I mentioned at the beginning is that you have to know what you want to do. And when I talk about the importance of the local scale and the difficulty of the national scale and how it's important to modulate what you recommend for those different contexts, one of the things you might want to think about is prevention, mitigation, and adaptation when it comes to climate change. Prevention and mitigation are the idea that you can either stave off altogether or really limit the damage caused by shifting the causes of climate change, reducing carbon emissions right away. Adaptation is much more about, well, the change is coming, the challenges are on the way, it's looming on the horizon, we need to shift what we do right now. And very broadly speaking, the prevention and mitigation strategies that most people talk about in policy operate at large scales. They don't always have to. There are local things you can do, but they're at national and international scale. But adaptation, I put it to you, is almost always a local affair. The resilience of your local infrastructure. Is your place, your town, self-sufficient if it needs to be? If lines of connection break down, if the waters rise a little bit more often than we used to, if the rain is especially heavy a little bit more frequently after a dry spell than it usually has been? Are communities themselves galvanized, ready to help each other out? The lesson that we've all learned from COVID is that often they are. So it is possible to make a difference locally, and often it's more possible because we're a smaller unit, because we have more shared interests based on place and our network and the things that happen locally. We might be able to move more quickly and work in our own small ways, not just at the household level, but as an influencing community that speaks up to the state, speaks up to government locally as well. That can happen a lot faster than change at the international scale. That's why the international community always drags its feet. There's always some outlier who scotches the deal, who doesn't play by the same rules. At the local scale, you might not be able to make such a big impact all at once, but at least you can start now. You can just start doing things. All right. So I've timed myself to 15 minutes, Jenny. Have I?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's lots more to
Thank you very
say. I
much.
think we're going to do a Q&A in a minute, but thank you very much for your attention. I'll hand back to Jenny.